Shalom and blessings in Messiah the Branch. This study is entitled The Solar Calendar Part B, and we will be summarizing extensively what we've talked about in the previous studies on the solar calendars in the solar calendar series. There will probably be one more after this, Part C, which will cover the final points that I would like to make clear to everyone listening. This is in response to Charles Pace attempting to redefine the natural and established equinoxes of Earth's relationship with the Sun and the historical basis of those two times of the year. This depiction here is once again from timeanddate.com. You can find similar diagrams like this and on National Geographic and other sources as well, on YouTube and just many other sources, just by typing in equinox in any search engine online. This particular diagram clearly indicates what happens twice each year, the September and vernal equinox, autumnal and vernal equinox, in the Earth's relationship with the Sun, when the Sun's rays are not only perpendicular with the equator of the Earth, but also perpendicular to the north-south axis of the Earth, as this diagram shows. This is a very clear representation of the natural motion of the Earth, and bear in mind this does not happen at any other time of the year other than mid-September and mid-March. This does not happen. This event in the natural realm of the Earth and Sun does not happen in mid-August, and it does not happen in mid-February. So please research this and validate it. Next, I would like to proceed before I read a article from an encyclopedic source. I'd like to do a summary of everything I've covered in this series to hopefully clarify any outstanding questions or doubts or validation of what I've presented here. That it's not my own thoughts, it's not my own theory. I am appealing to outside references that are universally accepted and undeniable in the natural world, and in the also in the revelation of sacred time. The natural movements of the Earth clearly show there is a seasonal change in the spring and autumn at the published time of the equinoxes, universally accepted historically and scientifically in astronomy. At the two equinoxes each year, the Sun rises due east and sets due west on these two cardinal points of the compass, on those 2 days only every year. As the Earth-Sun diagram shows, that I just opened with, the Sun's rays on the Earth are direct and perpendicular to the surface of the Earth, or perpendicular to the Earth axis, north and south, as the Sun crosses the equator on the 2 days of the equinoxes each year. Because of the direct east and west sunrise and sunset of the equinoxes every year, people in ancient times did not need any clocks, computers, astronomy programs, almanacs, or charts to determine the day of the equinox, both in September and March. The use of the equinox cannot and must not be used to count the weekly Sabbath day or change the universally and historically accepted weekly cycle. Such a practice has been taught and practiced by Charles Pace only since the spring of 2011. Such a practice cannot be proven historically or from any inspired messenger of the Advent movement, most especially from Victor Houteff. And remember, we need validation from 2 or 3 witnesses to prove a point, if it's in harmony with what is being said, even if it's just one other reference or messenger. But certainly going by the historical practice of all the messengers of the Advent movement. It is a fact in astronomy and in calendar calculation that the equinoxes do not fall on the same calendar days every year, or on the same day of creation week, the 4th day of the week, each and every year, when the sun, moon, and stars were created. The Sabbath day was never to be part of the calendar system of the yearly feasts or the monthly cycle whatsoever. Please bear in mind that the calendar days of every year, days of every month, the numbering of every day of the month, repeats itself only every 2 or 3 decades, when all the dates line up the same as they did 20 or 30 years before. I did a video article on that early on in the Branch Ensign channel, which you can, if you haven't watched all of those, you can go through it and see what I mean. It had to do with the repeat of the solar cycle periodically, but a great deal of time passing before that happens. It doesn't happen every year. As Victor Houteff stated in 13 Codes 7 and 8, the following paragraphs briefly bring forth, he states, the following paragraphs briefly bring forth solar, lunar, and biblical facts, not implications, that the weekly cycle never has been and never can be controlled by any lunar or solar calendar, and that the Church under God's direction has never, either in the Old or the New Testament, kept a lunar Sabbath. The Sabbath which the Lord hallowed was celebrated on exactly the 7th day after creation of the earth began, not on the 7th day after the creation of the moon began. That includes the sun. He's speaking here of the 4th day of creation. So the weekly cycle which God set in motion and the Sabbath which he himself celebrated were not measured by the revolutions of the moon, but by the revolutions of the earth. That's the daily cycle which we count. But you notice here he's not including any determination based on the 4th day of creation, but rather on the cycles of the revolutions of the earth, that is, Earth-Sun relationship, not the 4th day of creation. That's a whole different idea in creation week. And that's where people get confused about what's really being said here between what I'm saying and what Charles Pace is saying. Continuing on, had the Lord blessed and observed a Sabbath that is governed by the moon, then the Sabbath hours could not have fallen on the 7th day from the beginning of creation, but rather must have fallen within the 10th day, for the moon was not created and set in motion until after the 4th day of creation. Since the week is not then governed by the moon, it certainly cannot be governed by it now and still be the week of creation. As creation week was 3 days older than the sun and the moon, the fact conclusively follows, therefore, that neither neither of these heavenly luminaries could have ever regulated the week of creation. That's my whole point. We use the sun, the daily revolution of the earth, to mark the days, counting each day of the week according to our present system, and the entire weekly cycle since creation week. Moreover, such a solar lunar regulatory force would, except in the cycles of tens, deprive time and creation of the first 3 days, leaving them as a phantom lost period. So this is a fine point of truth that has to be understood concerning the calendar, that we use solar time to govern our daily cycle, the sunset to sunset time, governing our daily cycle, but we cannot use the 4th day of creation week in any modern calendar system or any calendar system after creation to change or violate the weekly cycle that was set up in creation week, based strictly on the first day of creation, not any other reference point, only the first day of creation. This is why I say, why Ellen White and many others have said, Victor Hodoff, that the weekly cycle and the 7th day are continuous since creation. They cannot be changed and they cannot be tampered with. The beast power of Daniel 7:25 will attempt to change times and laws, meaning he'll attempt to change, in this case, the natural change or redefine the natural motions of the earth, to redefine the very equinoxes, to change the Sabbath, to be in harmony with Rome. Continuing on here on my summary points. The previous statement by Victor Hodoff is true no matter what calendar is used, whether a 360-day calendar or a 364-day calendar or a 365.25-day calendar, which is the current length of the year on the planet Earth. There can be no perfect calendar until the Earth is righted on its axis, according to Benjamin Roden. There are no seasonal changes whatsoever on the Earth in mid-August or mid-February, based on Charles Pace's theory that the inclusion of the twilight times well after sunset are to be used in the determination of equal day and night for the purposes of the start of the year or the midpoint of the year respectively. Israel of old always used the daily time of sunset to count the days of the week, not twilight times, to know when the Sabbath day came. Charles Pace's theory of use of twilight times or twilight tables, which of necessity are computer generated, based on computer generated tables, completely mixes the yearly cycle with the independent weekly cycle of creation week. There is no argument or difference of opinion among anyone, scholars or the public at large, or even religious leaders, as to when an actual day ends, which is always at sundown, biblically. In the modern Roman world, the calendar day ends or begins at midnight, but the actual day, as Scripture clearly states, begins and ends at sundown. Charles Pace cannot prove his theory historically or from any kind of astronomy reference source. This is why Charles Pace does not approve of the use of astronomy programs that simulate the true motions of the Earth-Sun orbital relationship, and this is why he does not use or promote the use of dictionaries, historical, encyclopedia reference works, because they will not support his twilight theory of the equinox, redefining the equinox, or his change of the weekly cycle, making the day of the sun, the first day of the week, supposedly the permanent seventh day, supposedly stolen by the Church of Rome through calendar manipulation. Furthermore, he won't even give us references or an idea of when Rome actually did this. It didn't happen in 1582. There's no references of any weekly cycle change or change of the day of the week other than the calendar date accomplished in 1582. If the Jews lost track of the weekly cycle and their keeping of the seventh day, which happens to be the same day that Seventh-day Adventists keep the Sabbath, there's no record of it. How can he prove his point? And the Jews would have never gone along with a change in the weekly cycle. Someone would have protested. It would have been recorded somewhere, so that the church could have returned to it, as Victor Houteff says in 3 Answer Book 10 and 11. The 1582 calendar change did not create a new definition of the spring equinox. The astronomer Christopher Clavius in 1582 fixed the date of the equinox on the new calendar to March 21, which is almost always a day later than the true and natural equinox, which is March 20th, just as Victor Houteff published on his feast chart. By the way, you can go to the seasonal chart calculation function on timeanddate.com, and it will show you that the equinox does not even fall on March 21 anytime in this new century, from 2000 to 2099. It fell on March 21st a few times, one or two, or a few times in the previous century, in the 1900s, and in previous centuries. But for some reason, because of the leap year day calculation, the added day, this century it will not even fall not even once on March 21. But on the Catholic calendar, it does fall on that. That's what it means by fixing that the Christopher Clavius fixed the time of the equinox in 1582. He wasn't dealing with the true and natural equinox. He was dealing with strictly a calendar date. Next, Charles Pace's calendar theory that changes the historical Sabbath of the Advent movement will not fly and will not float. Why is it that the most clear, true, and evident times of the yearly equinoxes are brought to question and denial by Charles Pace, particularly when there are no published sources to prove his theory? The seasonal changes are clear and apparent to every culture on earth since the time of the flood of Noah. The sun, or twilight times, cannot be used to calendate the weekly cycle or change the weekly cycle. It has never been done by God's people, but only by the inventors of false calendars who end up using the fourth day of creation every year or every month to reset the weekly cycle, consequently resetting the weekly Sabbath day, either monthly or yearly. Victor Houteff never supported the calendation of the weekly cycle based on the fourth day of creation week. The weekly cycle was always independent and completely separate from the monthly and yearly cycles of time. This is exactly what Victor Houteff taught in Answer Book 3. Ellen White, James White, Joseph Bates, E.J. Wagner, A.T. Jones, J.N. Andrews, and a list of others were not Jesuit infiltrators of the Advent movement, or their writings completely changed, as claimed by Charles Pace in 2011. Charles Pace stated in 2011-2012 that the mark of the beast has always been in the church since 1844, which I completely reject. It is a redefining of the mark of the beast because Ellen White states in The Great Controversy that the mark of the beast is Sunday keeping, Sunday sacredness. You can look that up. I've quoted it in previous videos. And furthermore, here on the Ezekiel 4 chart, we'll notice, unlike what Charles Pace is saying, this is the 1844 movement from 1890 to 1930. Actually, it begins in 1844, but you'll notice, although the entire Protestant Reformation has these speckled dots all through this chart representing impurities in the teaching, that they didn't have all the truth. Those impurities had to be purified when the Advent movement began in 1840. And you'll notice very carefully in this chart, particularly you can see it whether it's blown up or not, enlarged. You'll notice that in the Advent movement here, first angel's message, second angel's message, third angel's message, there are no dots of impurity represented in Victor Houghton's own depiction. He drew this entire chart. There are no dots or no impurities, no falsehood in the 1844 movement, all through until today, following the line up to the line of purification, Revelation 18:1, coming up to the Second Brass Mountain Church in our day. So anyone who tells you that the original message or the foundation of the 1844 message is false, affected by or controlled by Jesuit infiltrators, is false, because Victor Houghton clearly depicts a pure movement, or rather a pure truth of the three angels' messages until our day, and also in the repeat of the three angels' messages. Please study this chart carefully and know the difference when the purification applies, and as far as truth goes. The truth from 1844 until the repeat phase of the three angels' message began in 1930 requires no purification. Neither Victor Houghton's message, Ben Roden's message, or Lois Roden's message does not require purification, because they all kept, observed, and upheld the foundational truths of 1844. Now, finally, in my summary here, prove all things, hold fast that which is good. 1 Thessalonians 5:21. Please understand what the mark of the beast is today. Ben Roden stated in branch lesson number 7 that the mark of the beast is incurred by the Revelation 18:1 movement. The Revelation 18:1 church, which is way up here at the top of this line, at the culmination of the three angels' messages in the repeat phase. And that's exactly what Ben Roden says in lesson 7 and in lesson 3. Only in lesson 7, he states it right at the top of the study in the preface, where he summarizes what is to take place in the Revelation 18:1 movement. There is an interesting article here. If you want to go to it, read it on your own. if you can copy this link here, you can read what historically what the Church of Rome has stated about the true Sabbath, seventh day, which happens to fall on our weekday of Saturday every week, and that the Church of Rome admits that Seventh-day Adventists do keep the true Sabbath. They have their reasons for saying that they want to solemnize Sunday, the first day of the week, rather than the true Sabbath. You can read that if you're interested in going to that link. I want to read a few excerpts, not too long, from about the Gregorian calendar from Wikipedia. I've covered this in previous videos, but I'm summarizing it here and emphasizing it. It explains exactly what the Gregorian calendar is and what it is not. And real quick before I go into this, here is a very brief summary from another study I downloaded on the calendar of exactly what took place in 1582. Please keep this in mind as I read through the Wikipedia article. This is a corroborating or agreeing article to every other source I've looked at. 1582 changes Julian to Gregorian calendar. 3 significant calendar changes took place in 1582 as a result of Pope Gregory XIII's decree. 1. Drop 10 days from the October 1582 to realign the vernal equinox with March 21st. That's how they fixed it. They fixed it to March 21st, and the equinox rarely falls on March 21st. Typically it falls on March 20th or March 19th, depending on the leap year day calculations of a particular year. Continuing on here, the Julian calendar, first adopted by Julius Caesar for the Roman Empire in 45 BC, had an annual error factor of 0.0636 days. From 45 BC to 1582, the correct day of the vernal equinox using the Julian calendar fell behind by a full 10 days. Now I showed that to you on the timeanddate.com, going back in their computational function back to the year 1582, and it did fall on March 10th, the equinox, that is, at least on the calendar. The equinox itself never changes, or the motions of the Earth-Sun relationship never change. Only the calendar dates can change because of the errors of man's attempted setting up a working calendar through the ages. There is no perfect calendar, particularly in a year with 365.25 days. It's not a perfect number. Number 2, reduce the number of possible leap years. This is what the Gregorian calendar did. Reduce the number of possible leap years. In the Julian calendar, a leap year occurred every 4 years. By reducing the number of leap years, the Gregorian calendar was able to more closely align the vernal equinox over the centuries. The change was made to make leap years for years ending in 00, but only if the number could be divided evenly by 400. The year 2000 was a leap year, etc. Year 1900 was not. Number 3, change the first day of the year from March 25th to January 1st. That was in 1582. This was the most dramatic change from the Julian to Gregorian calendar. Traditionally, the new year was determined by the beginning of the 4 seasons. And through several centuries, the first day of spring in the Julian calendar was on or about March 25th. Like I said, that was the Julian calendar. The Gregorian calendar corrected that and brought it to March 21st. That's still ballpark, but typically March 21st is still a day off from the true or natural equinox. The Protestant countries of Europe did not go along with Pope Gregory's decree in 1582. The lowland regions of Belgium, then part of Holland, and the northern German states, for example, were made up of Protestant Palatines, or I guess Protestant churches, Protestant movement. The Calvinists or the Lutherans. These groups did not adopt the Gregorian calendar until 1700, and it wasn't adopted in the British Isles until 1752. But that's just a quick overview of what the lengthy encyclopedia article states. I'm going to go through a few highlights here. Probably just reading in the green. Because the celebration of Easter was tied to the spring equinox, the Roman Catholic Church considered the steady drift of the date of Easter caused by the year being slightly too long to be undesirable. I'll go through this kind of slow if you want to read through it as I scroll through it. Welcome to, or stop the video and read it carefully for your own information on how the Gregorian calendar works in detail. But for now, I'm just going to read the green areas. The canonical Easter tables were devised at the end of the 3rd century, when the vernal equinox fell either on March 20 or March 21st, depending on the year's position in the leap year cycle, as the rule was that the full moon preceding Easter was not to precede the equinox. The equinox was fixed at March 21 for computational purposes, and the earliest date for Easter was fixed at 22 March. So he's saying here, they're saying here, the equinox was fixed at March 21 for computational purposes, or just for the calendar's sake. Even though in our present calendar, the equinox rarely falls on March 21st, and it doesn't fall once on March 21st in the 100 years of the 2000s, the century of the 21st century here. It did a very few times in the last century. The depiction of Christopher Clavius, the Pope's astronomer, and Pope Gregory XIII. Much of this article is highly detailed technical calendar calculations which are not essential to understand. This next paragraph in the green states the motivation for the adjustment was, that is, of the adjustment of the Julian calendar, was for the adjustment was to bring the date of the celebration of Easter to the time of year in which it was celebrated when it was introduced by the early church. Isn't that interesting? An interesting statement. Obviously, the early church, the 1st century church, this church of the first brass mountain here, depicted on Victor Hoddeff's chart, was keeping the equinox in latter part of March or the beginning of April, as Victor Hoddeff shows on his feast day chart. He actually puts he states in one of his studies that it's Passover falls here at the 15th, that it comes out typically, he states, on April 3rd every year. And if you're going by a strictly solar calendar, which I do, it's exactly where it falls out every year. April 3rd, beginning of Passover night. Now, as this article indicates, the early church celebrated the time of Passover before Easter was ordained by the Roman Church. They are observing Passover about the same time that the Catholic Church observes Easter, although they rarely ever coincide. That was dealt with in the First Council of Nicaea, 325 AD. Next paragraph, the background. Because the spring equinox was tied to the date of Easter, the Roman Catholic Church considered the seasonal drift in the date of Easter undesirable. The Church of Alexandria celebrated Easter on the Sunday after the 14th day of the moon that falls on or after the equinox, which they placed on 21st of March. However, the Church of Rome still regarded 25th March as the equinox until 342 and used a different cycle to compute the day of the moon. They were mixing the moon cycle and the solar cycle, just like the rabbinic Jews do on the Jewish calendar to this day. Victor Hodeff said in his study on the Sabbath and the calendar in 13 code that we're not to follow the moon because the lunar cycle has changed since the flood, or possibly even before the flood when sin entered. So further on here, they say, again speaking of the March 21st date, fixing that date on the calendar for the convenience of the celebration of Easter. Next paragraph, next heading, preparation. The Council of Trent approved a plan in 1563 that for correcting the calendrical errors, requiring that the date of the vernal equinox be restored to that which it held at the time of the First Council of Nicaea in 325, and that an alteration to the calendar be designed to prevent future drift. That's why they had to fix the date, because the dates of their feasts, the Catholic feasts, were drifting through the calendar. Some of these experts, including, I can't even pronounce the names, they're Italian, believed Easter should be computed from the true motions of the sun and moon, rather than using the tabular method, but these recommendations were not adopted. Ancient tables provided the sun's mean longitude. Christopher Clavius, the architect of the Gregorian Calendar, noted that the tables agreed neither on the time when the sun passed through the vernal equinox nor the length of the mean tropical year. So they were fixing the date of the equinox neither, as it says here, on the time when the sun passed through the vernal equinox nor on the length, etc. And like I said, I'm taking this from encyclopedic sources. You can go to Wikipedia and type in Gregorian Calendar, and this is what you'll come up with. It's quite an involved article. That's why I'm only reading portions of it. At the time of Gregory's reform, there had already been a drift of 10 days since the Council of Nicaea, resulting in the vernal equinox falling on 10 or 11 March, instead of that the 10-day drift should be corrected by deleting the Julian leap day on each of its 10 occurrences over a period of 40 years, thereby providing for a gradual return of the equinox to 21 March. And in that century, after they made the correction, it did come out March 21st occasionally, not always. Just like Victor Hodeff shows on his chart, the equinox comes out to March 20th most of the time, and September 22nd. Finally, this paragraph at the bottom section here. When the new calendar was put in use, the error accumulated in the 13th century since the Council of Nicaea was corrected by a deletion of 10 days. And he shows here in the next sentence, the Julian calendar day, Thursday, 4th of October, 1582, was followed by the first day of the Gregorian calendar, Friday, 15 October 1582. Cycle of weekdays was not affected. Please take note. The cycle of weekdays was not affected. They changed strictly the calendar date. From Thursday the 4th, the next day, 10 days were added, and it became Friday the 15th, October 1582. You notice Thursday and Friday are still intact, as goes our modern terminology of the weekdays. Those 2 days would be day 5 and day 6 on the Jewish calendar. But it doesn't matter what they call the days. We know what they are. The weekly cycle has never been lost. And I keep repeating that fact throughout this article. The new calendar was implemented in the blue section here. The new calendar was implemented on the date specified by the bull or the papal order, with Julian Thursday 4th, 4 October, being followed by Gregorian Friday 15 October 1582. And I'll probably conclude with this article here. Very complex in some respects. Finally, here they validate, in conjunction with the system of months, there is a system of weeks. In the green, when the Gregorian calendar was adopted by each country, the weekly cycle continued uninterrupted. And there are no historical references to say otherwise. So anyone who tells us the weekly cycle was changed or covered up or defeated, basically they're saying that God released his true people from observance of the true Sabbath whenever this supposed change happened, according to Charles Pace. And it wasn't restored until he began to open his mouth and teach on this in 2011. So if the time was covered up, everything Ellen White taught on the Sabbath was wrong, untrue. Might as well throw out the book, The Great Controversy, completely. And all the research of the various scholars in the Advent movement from that time forward, 1844, particularly the various scholars such as J.N. Andrews, E.J. Wagner, A.T. Jones, who carefully researched this topic. The SDA Church had a very strong and firm foundation, and that foundation or platform remains to this day, and we should remain on it. Remain on the platform. As it says here, when the Gregorian calendar was adopted by each country, the weekly cycle continued uninterrupted. Even the secular and civil historical resources tell us this truth, so that God's people do not need to question or stumble or be fooled or have the truth hidden from them. The Church of Rome could not defeat God's covenant of creation, Sabbath truth, and the marriage institution. The Sabbath institution and the marriage institution have never been covered up. They've been perverted, but never covered up. That's the end of the Wikipedia article. I've reproduced some of what Victor Hodeff states here. You can stop the video and read this if you like. I'm not going to read through it. End of Jezreel letter number 2, Victor Hodeff says the mark of the beast comes first in the church. Appears first in the church. Not in 1844, but in the branch movement, Revelation 18:1, exactly as Ben Roden states. And here he says, I've reproduced lesson number 7, the first top of the page, where he states from May 25th, 1958. The branch is Revelation 18:1. Point 3 says, the branch, or Revelation 18:21 or 18:1, incurs the mark of the beast first in the church. Not in 1844, but today. The 1844 movement was pure, so too all the other messages and movements since 1844. But the Mark of the Beast comes in to try to redefine terms, redefine the natural motions of the Earth-Sun relationship, redefine the equinox, redefine the daily cycle, beginning at sundown, not twilight times. He also says, Ben Roden even quotes Victor Houda from Jezreel Letter 2, end of Jezreel Letter number 2. You can read it for yourself. I will conclude here for part B of Solar Calendar, part 5B, and I'll conclude with part C in the next section. Please look at all the various video studies on this topic, almost exclusively on this topic of the Sabbath and the Advent movement since 1844 on the Branch Insight channel, where I cover it from every possible angle, not only from what the founding fathers and founding mother of the church presented, but also from historical sources that were used by Ellen White and those that came after her. Thank you for your attention. Prove all things, hold fast that which is good. Shalom.